Welcome, everyone, to the fourth episode of Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. As you already know, my name is Amanda Kelly. I am the Junior Risk Consultant at Plan to Protect, and I'm also the host of these weekly podcasts where we're going to be tackling topics of safety with a focus on achieving that highest standard of abuse prevention and protection for that vulnerable sector. These sessions are geared primarily to individuals and organizations that are directly serving that vulnerable sector, whether you be positioned at a school or a camp, a church, or other organizations that are servicing the sector. Once again, Melodie is back with us, Melodie Bissell, the Plan to Protect President and CEO, and the expert in all things vulnerable sector protection. Welcome, Melodie.
Hey Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Last week, we covered the question, can insurance companies exclude abuse and molestation from their insurance policy? And we had Ruth Bell Aslin, who is a life coach having retired from 30 years of being an insurance agent among churches and charities. So she had a whole well of information to be sharing with us last week. So if you haven't gotten the chance to listen, I really encourage you to go take a look at all of that content.
What was your biggest takeaway last week, Amanda?
Actually, my biggest takeaway is a really good stepping stone into what we're going to be talking about today. I don't know if you remember, but Ruth had one of these stories that she told of a phone call that she received while she was working in insurance from a client asking that if they could allow fireworks inside the building. I mean, can you imagine the potential harm to the building, to the people? It's just endless. It's such a crazy story, such a crazy question.
I'm sure Ruth has many, many of those stories. Um, I love to pick her brain, and I'm sure she's got many, many of those stories. That was just one of them, Amanda.
Oh boy. And I feel like Melody, you have a lot of stories to share too.
I do. Just one that I remember. I mean, I remember many of those. Those ones are hard to forget. But I can remember one time being in one of our administrator leader certification courses. And this is a group of leaders within their organizations that are responsible for abuse prevention and the protection of vulnerable adults, children, youth. And in this situation, one of the leaders, he had been in his role for 10 years. He actually stood up and said, "Excuse me, I've got a question." He said, "Are you telling me that when I take a group of young people away on a retreat and we stay in hotels, that we shouldn't be sleeping in the same bed as those young people? Is that what you're telling me?" At first, I thought he was joking, but he was so serious. And I said, "Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm saying. That, to avoid any risk, have your own sleeping arrangements. Don't share a bed with a minor." And he said, "Excuse me, I have to go make a phone call and book more hotel rooms because we're leaving on a retreat this weekend, and we have always shared beds with the young people in our program." So that was just one incident demonstrating high risk.
That's crazy. And it's being in the position for so long. Sometimes you think like, are you really asking that question? Is it not common sense? I mean, honestly, I thought we were being pranked, that day when someone called us on a Friday near their closing and asked if they needed to require life jackets for their junior high kids that were going whitewater rafting the following day.
Yeah, we actually thought that was a spoof on us, but they were dead serious. They wondered if they had to wear life jackets.
I can even remember a story where we heard that, small children in a daycare were being disciplined by being locked in a cabinet with a child security lock on it. We hear these absolutely crazy stories, but, they never seem to stop. They keep coming. And, before we get too into it, let's just bring in one more for
Okay.
fun.
Well, I do say that common sense is not all that common, but this time I'm going to tell on myself. And as I said, I wish I knew then what I know now, but I can remember a time when I was a youth sponsor. And have you ever heard the game Sardines, Amanda? Have you ever heard of this game?
I haven't, but it kind of sounds like fun.
Okay, so Sardines was it would be a late night event, and you literally would shut off all the lights in the building, and the leader would go hide somewhere in the building. Now, at this time, I was a youth director at a church. You're going to think all of these crazy stories are all happening in churches, but they're not. But they do happen in churches too. And we would shut off all the lights in the building, and the leader would go hide somewhere in the building in the dark, usually in a cupboard, in the baptismal tank, under a pew, wherever. You'd hide somewhere in the building. And then all the kids would have to divide up all by themselves and on their own go look for the leader. When they find the leader, they hide there in that very cloistered, small place, whether it's baptismal tank or a cupboard or a small room underneath the pew, wherever it is, and you would hide there. The two of you would, get as small as you can in that space until the third person would come and join you. And you would just pack yourself into that location until the last person was standing and found the whole group. Talk about high risk. I played that 40 years ago, but I hear that that same crazy activity is still being played these days. And again, just another huge, huge high risk situation that sometimes the kids would talk us into. Sometimes we just played it because we knew that we would be really popular by suggesting it, but it was in the dark, it was high risk.
And it sounds like a lot of fun. I think the problem with children is they're like master negotiators, and they're very, very persistent. So it's easy to cave. And while these seem like a lot of fun, a lot of organizations aren't putting the thought and prep time into actually doing this properly to making sure that, the risk is reduced as reasonably as it possibly can be. So, I mean, I think enough stories. We could probably be here all day. Melody, what would be your tips for addressing these high risk activities? So, what would go into the planning? And when we say high risk, it's, the likely to involve failure, injury, or harm. And we at Plan to Protect would even go on to add likely to lead to abuse or even likely to lead to an opportunity of abuse. But one of the questions that we actually receive a lot, and I'm sure we will receive more in the future, is do we have to be removing all of the fun out of our programming?
Well, so many of those activities are fun, and our intent at Plan to Protect is never to suck all the fun out of an activity. It's not to cancel all programming. Please don't decide that you're not going to work with children, youth, or vulnerable adults because of the risks involved. It's about managing those risks as best as you can to calculate the risk and the potential outcome of those risks. But the intent is never to cancel anything that involves children, youth, and vulnerable adults.
Absolutely. We don't want to have to ask organizations to get rid of everything fun that they're doing. There's a few different things that you can do to approach management of a risk. And if you wouldn't mind speaking to it, we have options like, avoiding the risk completely, retaining it, sharing the risk, transferring the risk, and reducing the risk. Would you mind speaking on those?
For sure. You are right. There's so many ways that we can manage risk, and we could avoid all risk. And as I said, we don't want you to avoid all risk. That's never the intent, but to know how best to manage it and to reduce the risk as much as possible. So as we consider what our activities are, we are not saying we want everyone just to sit at their desks with a paper and pencil in hand and avoid any fun activities. Um, you don't want to remove all sports from programs, all crafts using hot glue guns from programs. You don't want to do that, but you want to be able to manage those risks.
And you see risk pretty much in every single thing that you do. I mean, I'm definitely one of those people that still has a mark on my hand from a pencil stabbing me. And that would have just come from grade school. So, I mean, even you can get the risk of a paper cut from a piece of paper or, getting a piece of lead like into your hand from a pencil. But I do want to ask you really quickly about the dangers of what it sounds like retaining the risk. Would you ever advise to be doing that?
I can't imagine, and I can't recall ever a time in my history with Plan to Protect, or even as an executive director of a children's charity, where I ever would have made the decision or I would ever recommend making the decision to retain the risk. Retaining the risk could involve someone's life, someone's health, and safety. So, why would you ever make that call? Also, no one person should ever make that call on their own. I want to repeat that. I think that's so important. No one person should ever make the call on their own to retain the risk. If an organization was going to retain the risk for an event, and we referred to this last week on our podcast when we talked about the organization that decided that they were not going to worry about insurance anymore, that they weren't going to strive to qualify for abuse coverage. This is that organization that decided that they were going to retain the risk on their own. That decision should never be made by just a small group of people. It should be made by senior leadership. It should be a unanimous decision by the whole board with all the members notified that you are retaining the risk. That means that insurance isn't going to be covering this activity, and whatever the fallout of that activity is, you're going to cover any of the um, any of the outcomes of that injury, whether it involves someone's life, someone's health, someone's safety. And then once that decision has been made by all senior leadership and unanimous with 100% of the board members, all the members should be notified, but then parents and guardians should also be notified. So even if your members did decide to retain that risk, you need to make sure that you clearly communicate that to the parents and your volunteers, that you are retaining the risk. Really not something we would ever advise you to do.
I think what we see pretty often too is that too many people are thinking that if they can just get a parent to sign off on a waiver, then they're saying that they're letting go of all of their opportunity to be laying any charges or suing the organization. So they're letting go of the organization's liability on everything. And when it comes to just really retaining that risk, that liability form, that may not be the case where they'd be giving up any of the organization's liability. So, what would you advise that you do or for organizations to do, with dealing with those high risk activities? I think you've put together your top 8 recommendations for us. So, before we go into that, we should start off by, reiterating that high risk is an activity that is off site or any activity, that could easily lead to failure, harm, injury, or even abuse. So, would you be able to set us off with those 8 tips?
Actually, I will. And I just want to reiterate what you just said, that it's any activity that is off-site, but also those activities that are on-site that could pose a danger to the individual. So that might be some sports and activities that you do in your own building that could pose a physical, emotional danger or put individuals at risk of abuse. So the first of our tips today, actually, this idea came to us from Josh, who is our COO. He is also our amazing tech savvy person, podcast extraordinary. He's the one that's behind the scenes here. And he taught us a few years ago something that he picked up. He actually lives in the UK, and he was teaching for a while in the UK. And any time that a teacher is going to do an offsite field trip in UK, they have to do an event risk assessment. They have to come up with a whole plan that they submit to their senior leadership, the administration of the school. They have to go and fill out an event risk assessment online, and they actually have to go and visit the site a few weeks prior to the field trip so that they can complete their plan and complete the online event risk assessment. So that's our first tip.
So you actually recently developed one of these, the event risk assessments for our clients. So if they answer yes to any of the questions, or it's scaled from 1 out of 4, what signals them that there's, or sorry, it does signal them that there's a risk. So when they're answering yes, it's when there is a risk present in that event. So what would be the next step if that occurred?
Absolutely. So if they answer yes to any of those questions, this was such a good idea that we developed this on behalf of our members and clients. Then they move on to tip number 2. And with those identified risks in place, they should strengthen their plans. So if they answered yes to any of those questions, they need to go back to their planning stage and they need to strengthen their plan. So either they can do that through increasing supervision, and hear me say that means adding more chaperones, staff, volunteers, to hire certified instructors. That might be a lifeguard or someone who's certified in archery or certified in rock climbing. It also means modifying your plan by potentially reducing isolation, restricting some of your plans. If you are going to go on a water slide or to a water park, that might be meaning once you've gone to visit that water park, identifying what are the activities, what are the slides you're not going to allow the kids to participate in. And as much as they may want to go on the Calypso or go on the Typhoon, which is like a near vertical slide, which is high energy and high speeds of anywhere from, like 30 to 65 miles an hour going down a vertical slide, that would be considered very, very high risk. Riders and end up hurtling themselves into deep water. um, that would mean restricting that and saying, okay, we're still going to go to the water park, but we're going to avoid those slides that are high risk.
So that kind of seems like a bit of a no-brainer. Like you can just look at an activity and really be able to assess, like, is that too dangerous or is that something that we can reasonably do? So then after that, after they've done that, what would bring us to step number 3?
So, step number 3 is then to reach out to your insurance company. Don't wait to an hour before the activity or the night before, but reach out to your insurance company and secure written approval or opinion on the activity and the, the programs or the high risk activities that you're doing. You will want to make sure that your insurance cover will allow these events from taking place. I know some insurance companies that do not allow playing dodgeball. They've had so many accidents and injuries with some of their clients where there have been, you know, eggheads and bruises and split open skulls from playing dodgeball, that insurance companies have said, we are not going to cover you for dodgeball. I know also if an insurance company knows that those individuals that are driving for an offsite trip, if they're under the age of 25, they may not cover you for that kind of activity. So you want to get at that point, tip number 3 is getting insurance company opinion and approval that they are covering you. And that is a way that you transfer the risk to the insurance company.
Actually, because you brought up driving, driving is something that we see come up a lot. For organizations, it seems to be the most efficient option to just be using their own drivers with their own personal vehicles. But that's actually not the safest option. And in a lot of cases, the insurance company is not going to cover that. So I kind of want to just like wave a red flag there for organizations to relook at how they're transporting individuals or vulnerable persons to and from programming, because a lot of the time you may not be doing it the safest way possible. We would definitely recommend using commercial carriers in every opportunity that you can. And then if you do have to be using personal vehicles, then to be checking with your insurance company with what requirements that they have, especially to ensure to cover the vehicle as well. So then that would bring us to tip number 4.
Tip number 4 is preparing and drafting a letter of informed consent. This is not just a release and a waiver. A letter of informed consent, the purpose of it is this is how you're going to share the risk with parents. This is a document that communicates to parents and caregivers, guardians, the identified risks that you have identified and you've already communicated, that you're ready to communicate to your supervisors. So you're drafting that informed letter of consent where you've identified what the risks are and the steps that you have taken. And I often see this missing on releases and waivers. As you said, so often organizations just use a release and waiver saying, I waive any rights to sue. But a letter of informed consent is sharing the risk with parents and guardians where you've identified what all the risks are and the damages that could happen if those risks actually occurred. But you're also stating the steps you have taken to reduce those risks. You don't only, yes, you do want to, in some ways, make sure parents are aware of the dangers and the damages that could happen, but you also want to say these are the steps that we have taken to reduce those risks. So just as a reminder that in United States, in Canada, states, provinces, and territories, in most cases, parents cannot waive the right for their children to file a lawsuit when they are an adult. So when you're asking for a release and waiver, the only person that can sign that is the actual parent, and they're only signing that release and waiver on their own behalf as an individual. So you do want to make sure that you recognize what you're doing here is sharing the risk with parents so that they can never go into a court of law and say, well, I never knew. They never told me that they were going to be allowing kids to drive motorized vehicles or rock climbing or, doing, vertical slides. Rather, you're telling the parents what those activities are and you're sharing the risk with them.
And just a reminder, these should be used for every single high risk activity. So, for those of you that are a member, you can find an example of this on our member section. You can also see it at the back of our manual. So, if you have specific questions about that informed letter of consent, what it's waiving, or if parents have concerns, we always recommend that you do consult with a lawyer. Okay, number 5.
With your assessment in hand, with your plan in hand, with your insurance opinion, written opinion in hand, and your draft letter of informed consent, now you're going to go to your leadership and secure approval. You're going to get their approval, and this should either be from the board or your senior leadership. That even if you are a staff pastor, a staff director, you want to make sure for your protection too, that you've got approval from someone that you report to, that yes, with this information in hand and your thorough plan in hand, they review the documentation and then they sign off, written signature off, approving that yes, you can proceed with your activity.
Absolutely. Never, ever, ever go ahead with a high risk activity without having that written approval from your leadership or from your supervisors. Okay, so number 6.
Number 6, okay, you've got your permission from your senior leadership in hand or from the board in hand. Now you're going to inform the parents. This should be done 1 week in advance, where you send out your letter of informed consent for parents to sign that they are giving permission. Please don't bypass this. This is at the point, we're at tip number 6 here. This is when you tell the kids. Okay, this is when you tell the students that you're going to go on a field trip at the same time that you communicate it to parents. It should be done hand in hand. Don't bypass this. Don't tell the kids. You don't want to set yourself up for disappointment here, for the kids to be disappointed. You want to avoid that disappointment among the students, to find out that either the insurance company won't allow it or your leaders won't allow it. So until you've secured approval from your leadership and from the insurance company, then you can distribute it to the parents.
And I want to highlight that at least 1 week in advance. This time frame is also to allow for parents, to have a time to review those risks that they're consenting their child to be exposed to. And it also even gives them the opportunity to obtain legal advice or consultation if they feel that it's needed, and also to address with leadership any concerns that they might have about the activity before these letters have to be collected and before the consent has to be collected. So, number 7.
Well in advance, you want to make sure that you screen and train your volunteers and your staff, your chaperones that are participating in this activity, this high risk activity, or this trip. Don't do what one of my staff members did, where she called me from a bus stop while the kids are climbing onto the bus to go on a 1 week residential camp event. And my staff member called me from the bus stop and said, "Oh, Melody, what should I do? I just realized that one of my drivers and one of my cooks has not been screened and trained." Don't wait to the last minute to discover that some of your workers are not screened and trained. There's no reason today that you can't have all your staff and volunteers screened. With third-party providers of criminal record checks, and this is a service that we offer at Plan to Protect with Plan to Protect Screening Canada and our partners in third-party screening, where you can't have a criminal record check returned to you within hours. With online training and our school online, all your volunteers and staff should be able to be fully screened and trained with our screening services and our training services, so everyone who's representing your organization in this high risk activity or on your field trip are fully screened and trained.
And that's also something that that's why we say, well in advance. This is quite a process for properly screening and training, but there's absolutely no excuse for someone to be omitting this part of all of the tips, especially when we offer everything that they need. So if you're noticing or if you're recognizing that a lot of your staff and personnel have not been screened and trained, but you're not sure where to start, reach out to us and we will help you. We have the tools, we have the resources to help you complete that whole step 7, because if you don't, it ends up being such a huge liability and a huge negligence issue on behalf of that organization, especially if something were to happen. So again, check out your personnel files and make sure that everyone is up to date, especially if you are going on an offsite trip. And if not, take a pause, contact us. We will help you out. We will make sure that that person is completely screened and trained up to the standard that they need to be. Okay, we're winding down. We finally made it to the last tip. So, Melody, what's tip number 8?
Tip number 8 is something I say all the time. Keep the paperwork, keep the documentation. Don't throw away the documents. Don't do what I found one of my staff members did on a Monday after a long weekend where they had taken some kids on a canoe trip for the weekend. I walked into my office and I saw all the letters of informed consent in the garbage can where they had thought, well, they don't need this anymore. The event is over, so they could throw away all of these letters of informed consent. You want to make sure that you keep the paperwork. That paperwork, whether it is your permission forms, your attendance records, any incident forms that have been filled out, any injuries that occurred during the trip or the activity, keep that paperwork. Keep that paperwork permanently.
And another thing that I do want to highlight is documentation retention. It does look different in Canada than it does in the States as well. So if you are in the States, you want to check out your specific state guidelines on documentation retention and how to be storing it and how long you can keep it. So I just wanted to quickly highlight that. But, going back to all of these tips, they seem to be very, very doable. Do you honestly think, Melody, that most organizations follow these 8 tips?
No, Amanda, I don't. I think too often decisions to go off site happen at the last minute when another plan falls through, when uh, another team member doesn't show up, something falls through, their original plan ends up not working out because of a rain date or something. They don't have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D in mind. They make decisions without looking at the big picture and without remembering how important it is to have a plan to protect. So again, common sense is not all that common. It takes a whole team of people to reduce the risk, to manage the risk appropriately. That's why I think it's so important to be really held accountable for the actions and the decisions that you make.
Absolutely. And it's like you said, yeah, common sense is really not all that common in a lot of cases. So I really want to encourage our listeners because sometimes even regular programming that they're doing all the time can be high risk and they just haven't flagged it as such. Or, you could be doing a program or an event yearly for the past 10 years and you haven't put into place what you need to really be reducing that risk. It's never too late to be implementing these practices, and they are all very, very doable. So that does bring us to the end of the podcast today. I just want to do a very, very quick run through of those 8 steps for reducing, sharing, and transferring high risk activities. So, number 1 was assessing the risk. 2, modify the plan. 3, contact your insurance company for written opinion and to ensure that you are covered for the activity. 4, draft an informed letter of consent. 5, secure senior leader or board approval. 6, inform parents, have them sign that informed letter of consent. 7, screen and train your workers. And finally, 8, keep the documentation. It's a long list, but if you break it down and work through it, it's not a lot of work to really be reducing that risk. It is absolutely 100% worth it. We will say to do it a million times over because you can. It is never too late. Get on board with this. So, in closing, the podcast today, I just want to let everyone know it's sponsored by our membership program. Plan to Protect offers 3 levels of membership. There is basic, implementation, and going the distance. With our membership, you have access to that event risk assessment that we've noted earlier. You also have access to a number of trainings as well if you're needing to train your staff. And also, there is discounts on the screening. So it ends up being an all inclusive package that can help you really be reaching these 8 steps. And also, there's the ongoing email and phone support, plus so much more. So if you have any questions about our membership, absolutely contact us at info at plantoprotect.com. We have membership brochures that we can send to you, and we're happy to answer any of those questions that you might have. So, Melodie, before I wrap it up, do you have any last words?
No, but just stay safe and work the plan.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Melodie, and take care, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Amanda.